Welcome everyone to the Sitrep podcast channel, your forward operations base for all things military historical wargaming. I'm your host, Oriskany Jim, and today we are back to finish up the largest game of Panzer Leader I've ever personally played, recreating the Omaha Beach landings during Operation Overlord on 6 June 1944. Part 1 of this episode is already on our YouTube channel. There's a link to Part 1 in the description of this video. Check it out if you want to see what we've done so far. A quick summary of some of the things we've covered so far. We talked about how the game board for this scenario covers 3,000 hexes. We talked about how we're using a ground scale of 150 meters per hex and why we made the change from the Panzer Leader standard of 250 meters per hex. But even at this reduced ground scale, this game still would cover in 15 millimeter a game board larger than an American football field. It's 72 kilometers square. We talked about how we're covering all of Omaha Beach, both assault sectors, 1st U.S. Infantry, 29th U.S. Infantry, hitting elements of the German 352nd Infantry Division. In all, we're going to have 450 plus units on the map. This game is going to run for 20 turns, and how in actual game time, it took 25 hours to complete this game. So yeah, that's why we didn't do it live. We talked about all the special rules that we're going to use for this scenario, as well as 5 key features to keep an eye on as the turns progress. Number 1, the sheer scale of the game. With a map this big, we don't have to take any kind of logarithmic shortcuts. We can present the game at its true scale and geometry. We talk about how small the German forces facing the American invasion on Omaha actually were. We talked about the incredible difficulties the Americans faced when coming ashore at Omaha, and how our special rules reflect the difficulties of mounting an amphibious assault under fire. We talked about the pivotal role of combat engineering, and man, in part 1 of this episode, we've already really seen that make a big impact on the table. And of course, we talked about the absolute killer difference that naval gunfire support can make, especially when you have not 1 but 2 American battleships now that we're in the later phases of the game. USS Arkansas, USS Texas, 6 destroyers, 2 cruisers. Historically, USS Texas came within 1.5 miles, and some of those destroyers came within 400 yards of the waterline. So yeah, you're talking about some pinpoint naval gunfire and some very, very serious firepower coming down on these German defenders. So far, we've completed 8 turns of this 20-turn monster, and American casualties have been appalling. In some parts of the beach, even worse than they were historically. A big part of the reason for this is American combat engineers that went in with those opening waves are going in with the assault companies and trying to clear blocks, trying to clear minefields. They're actually assaulting up the bluff on those German fortifications. That means what they're not doing is clearing beach obstacles. Therefore, follow-on waves are hitting these beach obstacles, and the Americans are still losing a huge number of people just trying to get out of the water. However, some follow-on engineers have now taken to task of knocking out these beach obstacles and opening up lanes in the German coastal defenses, and now 3rd, 4th, and 5th waves of American forces are having a little bit of an easier time. The Americans are making better progress though, especially in the east. One draw is already completely open, one of the draws leading towards Saint-Laurent. They have cleared both minefields in front of the draw, they've blown up the block that was sort of covering that draw, and they've taken both objectives, the one at the mouth and the one at the summit of the draw. So yeah, the Americans are making pretty good progress objective-wise and geography-wise. They're just paying a much higher butcher's bill for it. Another thing that's going extremely well for the Americans are their tanks. Historically, barely a handful of those duplex-drive Shermans actually made it to the beach, and that's one of the reasons why Bloody Omaha was so bloody. Here in our game, though, a lot more tanks have made it onto the beach. They are providing immediate and pinpoint direct fire support for those assault companies on the beach. They're knocking out those German Widerstand-Nester bunkers, and they're helping pry open those draws. In summary, this is what was supposed to happen on Omaha Beach. It certainly isn't what happened historically. So far our game is turning into more of a recreation of how Omaha should have happened if it had gone according to plan. So that's where we stand so far. It is 8:54 hours on 6 June 1944. Let's get back to the seawall and see what happens. So here was our situation at the end of turn 8. You'll notice where I'm now including in my maps this dotted white line that shows the forward line of contact for American positions and more or less the extent of their advance at the time as indicated on the map. You'll see now as we click forward into turn 9 where the Americans have made some modest progress. However, in too many places, the Germans continue to put up very stubborn resistance in certain key points that are really gumming up the rate of the American advance. One of these points is on the extreme western end of the battlefield at Widerstand-Nester 72. So I will zoom in to show what I'm talking about. Here's Widerstand-Nester 72 on the extreme western end of the battlefield. You'll see where it directly overlooks the Vierville Draw, or Dog 1 as it was codenamed by the Americans. It starts here at that objective hex, and it ends here at this objective hex, and it leads directly towards the village of Vierville. This is one of the 4 draws that the Americans have to open. They have cleared out Widerstand-Nester 71. We saw that in part 1 of this video. That's great. That opens up one shoulder here of the draw. The other shoulder, however, remains firmly in German hands. The German units holding Widerstand-Nester 72 have taken a bit of a pounding. You'll see these black smoke columns. Each one of those columns indicates a destroyed infantry platoon or gun battery. However, both of these fortification counters are still strongly garrisoned by solid German platoons. We have 2 types of German infantry platoons holding these positions. The weaker ones here, indicated by Panzer Leader security platoons, are the levies taken from nearby coastal defense divisions. Meanwhile, the full-powered platoons with the full combat values are the actual hardcore cadre taken from 352nd Infantry Division, 84th Army Corps. So zooming in a little bit more, we will see where the German Panzerschreck section is still knocking out more Shermans. The Americans are having a hell of a time clearing out that last bit of resistance there at the mouth of the Vierville Draw. They've taken out the block, but they can't take out all the German infantry and half-tracks that were stationed behind the block. The Americans, again, have taken out Widerstand-Nester 71 and have more or less bypassed that position. They are now engaged in a frontal assault against Vierville itself. So both the mouth and the crest of the Vierville Draw are under simultaneous assault. One interesting thing to note, we do have a duel of anti-aircraft vehicles here. We have an American M16 battery versus a German Flak-Trek, I call them a battery. These are the Sonderkraft Zeuge 10/4s. This is the 2-centimeter automatic cannon mounted on the back of a half-track. And fear the German bicycle troops. Those people who play Panzer Leader, I'm only kidding. They do carry rifles though, so they do have a little bit of combat value. They are under full frontal assault, however, by the remnants of Charlie Company 2nd Ranger Battalion. Of course, this is the movie-famous unit that we see in Saving Private Ryan under Captain, quote, John Miller. Charlie Company 2nd Ranger Battalion was, of course, really commanded by Captain Ralph E. Goranson. So he's got his guys here, already with Vierville, under direct infantry assault. Moving further to the west, we see where other Widerstand-Nester are under pretty dedicated assault. We have George and Kidnap Company of 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 116th Regimental Combat Team, 29th Infantry, trying to take out Widerstand-Nester 70. They've had this thing under close assault for about 3 turns now. It just isn't cracking. They have to go over a double bluff. You'll see where there are 2 elevation lines, changing from, for example, hex 0915 to hex 1015. That's going to slow them down, and plus, again, there's a full-scale fortification counter in there. And of course, we're using the fortification and improved position rules out of Arab-Israeli wars. So they're actually really tough. These Germans are in a very solid position. True, they're about to get outflanked and encircled along both wings, but long story short, take your first shot. That's a very tough strong point that so far, 116th Regimental Combat Team is having a very tough time taking. Not so much over here, where Widerstand-Nester 68 is finally starting to crumble. This rifle platoon has already been eliminated. It's been completely blown out of there, and this 5-centimeter anti-tank gun battery has been knocked out. The Americans are coming up this bluff very strong. They've got it enveloped on both wings. That's doing pretty well here. Same thing here, where German Pioneers and a submachine gun platoon is under attack by, it looks like, about half of a battalion. Again, each one of these counters is a platoon of 40 to 50 men. They're being assaulted from 4 different positions here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, those guys didn't last very long. And that is going to open up a nice big gap here along this second draw. Widerstand-Nester 65 was doing pretty well until 2 of its units got pinned down, and now they have failed to rally. Adding to their problems, they're getting outflanked by no less than 17 tanks. So these engineering tanks with the dozer blades are 4 tanks apiece, and this is a full line platoon of 741st Tank Battalion. That's why his values are a little bit better. So yeah, 5 plus 12, we are looking at 17 tanks that has already taken this exit draw hex here, and they are now moving off of that and beginning to outflank this position. They don't want to move too far away from it. You'll notice that they're going to hang around there for a little while. If they leave it completely empty and unguarded, some of these German mobile units might rush forward and take it back. And who wants to pay for the same real estate twice? Widerstandsnester 64 was holding out pretty well. They're starting to give up the ghost, however. You'll see where these 10 Shermans have now executed an overrun attack on some of the German fortifications' flanking positions. You're not allowed in Panzer Leader to overrun a fortification. You literally can't drive your tank over a bunker. It doesn't work. However, their supporting positions, like IPs, again, that's going to be barbed wire, foxholes, slit trenches, those things you're allowed to overrun with no problem. So there have been overruns, there have been American cat attacks. That position has now fallen. These guys are now all alone. And you'll see with these 4 artillery markers, there's a battleship naval gunfire strike about to land on their heads. Yeah, I wouldn't expect to see these guys last very much longer. Where the situation is pretty much all good news for the Americans is further over here into the Big Red 1 sector, where the 4th draw has been busted completely open by, it looks like, about half of 741st Tank Battalion, followed up by elements of 3rd Battalion, 16th Regimental Combat Team. They have punched completely through the first hex that indicates the opening of this 4th draw. They've pushed completely up the draw, and they are now pushing into Colleville-sur-Mer, and they've now made contact with German half-tracks. We've got a platoon of Shermans in point-blank contact with some German 5cm anti-tank guns on half-tracks. I don't expect too much of a resistance put up by the Germans here. However, they are in buildings, they are in concealed positions, and they are on higher ground, and the Sherman tank is up there pretty much all by himself. So the fight is still going on here, but there's the second objective hex that opens up the 4th draw. I'm not sure if the Germans are going to be able to hold out too long in this area of the map either. Now we are moving into turn 10, and we see where the Americans have actually taken a little bit of a bloody nose here. They have taken that first hex of Colleville-sur-Mer. However, it has cost them 3 armor platoons, although they're not all tanks. We've got some tanks, we've got some half-tracks, we've got more of those M16 anti-aircraft vehicles are now disordered. There's a little bit of a gun battle. You know what this almost reminds me of? The last battle in Saving Private Ryan in reverse, where it's American tanks moving through the French village and German infantry that's lighting them up. I told you, beware the German bicycle troops. They're tougher than they look. Again, I'm just kidding. There's also pretty good German flanking fire coming down here from Widerstandsnester 63. That's actually hitting some of these American positions down here, further down into Draw 4. Although again, the Americans are bringing up what looks like a full battalion. When it comes to artillery, each counter usually represents a battery. So 1, 2, 3 batteries of 105s on M73s are now coming up the road. Yeah, again, over here to the eastern part of the battle, the Germans really did get the short end of the stick right off the bat, and the Americans have more or less been on a rampage over here to the east. It looks like Widerstandsnester 64 has finally fallen. That thing put up a hell of a position. You'll see here where these Americans, we looked at these American tank platoons last turn, they have not moved. That was not a mistake. They were waiting to pull up more reinforcements behind them, and now the exit of this 3rd draw is much more secure. Now that the bulk of 741st Tank Battalion is in place, along with supporting infantry of 16th Regimental Combat Team, 1st U.S. Infantry, this wing of the American advance is in a much better position to drive deeper into the German backfield. Holy crap, yeah, this is the brute application of force. A lot of times in Panzer Leader, and especially when it comes to amphibious assault games, it comes down to just how hard can you hit a position to finally clear it out. So this is finally the end of Widerstandsnester 66, where the Americans have hit it with 1, 2, 3, the better part of a battalion, while outflanking it with a 4th full company, complete with combat engineer support and machine gun sections. This was 450 men attacking 100 Germans in this little town hex. Yeah, that would have made for a hell of a Flames of War battle. The other covering shoulder of this draw, however, is still well covered by Widerstandsnester 68. Again, there's about another 200 Americans about ready to hit that place, along with 9 tanks coming around their right wing. Over here to Widerstandsnester 70, the Americans weren't able to put quite that many infantry into an assault. What they did, however, start to put in is all kinds of artillery support. And I'm not talking about warships, I'm talking about direct artillery support right off the beach. This is the kind of thing we didn't really see on Omaha Beach historically, but the Americans have had a much easier time getting armor on the beach, and this allows the Americans to actually start setting up artillery on the beach for direct fire assault on remaining pockets of German resistance. Another big thing that's really helped out here is the U.S. Army Air Force. Those P-47s have been cruising around the German backfield and more or less cleared out all German artillery positions. So that German pre-sighted rule that we were talking about in part 1 doesn't really matter anymore, because the Germans can have all the pre-sighted artillery charts they want. If they don't have the tubes to actually deliver ordnance onto those pre-sighted hexes, the Americans can then conversely set up their own artillery and apply that direct fire as we're seeing here. But time and time again, we keep coming back here to bloody Vierville, where the Germans are finally starting to crack a little bit, those murderous little Panzerschrecks. I actually hope the Americans didn't take any prisoners in that platoon. He took out the better part of a company of tanks by himself. A company of tanks. You see the wreck counters here. Meanwhile, 2 more companies of Rangers, Able and Baker Company, have now landed. They're pushing up the slope. Again, they're making progress. It's just a slow and bloody business. So as the Americans continue their assaults to grind down the strong points of stubborn German resistance, we move forward into turn 11. And we see where, for starters, the Americans have mounted a little bit of a rally here at the outskirts of Colleville-sur-Mer. They brought up additional tank support of the 741st, and there's still a hell of a battle here. The Germans have only given up the very first hex of the village, and yeah, this fight is definitely still in progress. And the American column is still taking pretty good flanking fire from Widerstandsnester 63. The Americans are continuing to clean out the remaining Widerstandsnester 65 that was overlooking their approach into this third draw. They're having a little bit of a tough time cleaning out this German fortification that's overlooking their advance, and thus fully opening up this route of advance down here towards Saint-Laurent. And as I keep saying, once we go further to the west, things continue to get more gruesome. The Germans have now been completely encircled here at the mouth of the second draw, so that's good. They still haven't completely given up, however. And yeah, Widerstandsnester 70 is finally fallen. We see where that last German platoon there is now knocked over. He's finally out of there, but good grief, it took almost 2 hours of close combat to clean out that position. Speaking of taking too long to clean out a position, Widerstandsnester 72 is still holding out, although it has now cracked. More American naval gunfire is coming in at it now, and it looks like Charlie Company 116th Regimental Combat Team has it completely outflanked. It's damn near cut off. And again, there's 2 whole companies of fresh Rangers coming up the bluff. I don't expect the Germans to last too much longer in there, but again, the Americans still aren't making very good progress into Vierville itself. Why is Vierville so important? Again, one of the required objective hexes the Americans have to take to win the game is in that village. We see it there under this German transport. So they're not able to bring up too much in the way of support until, again, these positions get cleaned out further back. Moving from turn 11 into turns 12 and 13, we're going to start doing 2 turns at a time here. We see where the Americans are still sort of held up on the flanks. So we see where the Americans have finally cracked the German position and taken this objective hex that indicates the exit of this 4th draw that starts way back here. The 4th draw is now completely open. The Americans have finally detached 3 companies and some self-propelled artillery support to turn to their left wing and start to clear out this flanking position that's been pouring fire down into for at least 2 or 3 turns now. Long story short, take your second shot. Widerstandsnester 63 might be in a bit of trouble here. Heading further to the west, we see where the Americans have finally effected a real breakout out of that 3rd draw. They've had that 3rd draw open for quite a while, but with these flanking positions finally cleared out that was threatening the safety of that draw, they're now able to move tons of armor and lots of fresh infantry down this road, and they are now attacking Saint-Laurent itself. The Americans also have the exit hex of this 2nd draw under fire, held by anti-tank half-tracks and those dreaded bicycle troops. So in all seriousness, I don't expect that position to hold out for very long. And pretty soon they're going to have Saint-Laurent in a bit of a pincer as soon as they can develop that 2nd jaw and really put the German positions in that town, including their overall regimental commander there, into a bit of a vice. And lo and behold, the full-bore assault on Vierville has finally started. The Americans were finally able to pull up enough firepower. The good news is, once the Americans did manage to get it organized, it looks like the Germans are crumbling pretty quickly because the sheer amount of firepower that the Americans are bringing to bear. I'll zoom a little bit so we can take a closer look at it. Outside of this one little Italian command post, yeah, this whole position has fallen pretty much all at once. This leaves us just with the unfortunate guys left up here at Widerstand 72. I swear to God, I hope these guys get the Iron Cross or something, because they're still holding out. They're outnumbered at least 4-1 against American Rangers, no less, yet they're still holding on. So here at the end of turn 13, the Americans have already achieved well beyond the historical results here at Omaha Beach. And in fact, the Americans have technically already won the game, to be perfectly honest. There are 11 objective hexes on the map. The Americans are required to take at least 7 of them before the end of the game. And they've got, at the moment, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. With, quite frankly, 2 more, 7 and 8, about to fall. Objective hex number 7 here has basically already fallen. There are no living Germans in that hex. The Americans just have to move forward at the beginning of turn 14 and occupy it. So they technically have 6, effectively they have 7, and realistically they already have 8 because these guys aren't going to last very long. So long story short, take your third shot. The Americans pretty much have this game in the bag already. Moving forward now through turns 14 and 15, we see where, yeah, things have finally broken open for the Americans, especially here at Saint-Laurent. I was warning you that they were going to develop this second attack out of the northwest, and they now have Saint-Laurent not only in a pincer, but more or less encircled. Notice that the overall German commander, he has now been destroyed, and the Germans failed their morale check. So the entire table just dropped for the Germans from morale B to morale C. So as if the Germans didn't have enough problems, now they've got another thing to worry about. And lo and behold, I told you it would happen eventually. Oh, it looks like Widerstand 72 has finally fallen. Now that doesn't make that much of a difference here in our game, but historically this made a huge difference because the original mission for these units in 2nd Ranger Battalion was to head off the west end of the beach and hook up with either American airborne troops or the rest of the Rangers that had landed at Point 2-0. Needless to say, that didn't come close to happening on the historical D-Day here on Omaha Beach, but who knows, it might start happening here in our game. One last quick thing to mention here is some of these priests have now curled back around almost behind the American position facing backwards, and they're now taking Widerstand 60 on the extreme east end of the map under some direct artillery support. They're not going to last very long at all. Plus, there's some naval gunfire coming down on them. So as German positions here finally start to crack and crumble, we click forward through turns 16 and 17. And yeah, their position has more or less collapsed completely. You see where Widerstand 60, as predicted, didn't last very long at all. That was pretty much the end of that position. The Americans have now moved on to Cabourg. The Americans have more or less cleaned out Colleville-sur-Mer, although, again, there's a little bit of resistance in there, and that's about it. Now it's more or less rampaging columns of American armor and mechanized infantry. These are clearly not units coming in off of Higgins boats. They are coming in on LCTs and other Navy landing ships, and they're heading down these roads that are opened up, and they're just racing through the bocage. They're trying to link up with this line of villages way down here on the very bottom of the map and establish some sort of a forward perimeter while they bring on still more American forces onto the beach, which, as you can see here, open, all these open counters. At long last, it looks like the Americans have opened up big gaps in German beach obstacles. It's now, outside of a boating accident, pretty smooth sailing, no pun intended, for the Americans to actually get onto the beach. So, wrapping things up, once and for all, we're going to click through the last 3 turns of the game, 18, 19, and 20. To be honest, there's not a whole lot going on at this point. There almost isn't a single German unit left. I'm looking at one little company of German transport. There's like some Kubelwagens and empty half-tracks down here. This section of trucks has now been destroyed out of Colleville-sur-Mer. That's pretty much it. There wasn't a whole lot left going on. What we do have, however, are the 115th Regimental Combat Team coming in 29th Infantry Sector and the 18th Regimental Combat Team coming in 1st U.S. Infantry Sector. This game did have them included. Turns out they weren't really needed. And this game also gave the American player the option of whether to put both of these regimental combat teams in one or the other invasion sector. Kind of what happened historically. Historically, things over here to the west, back here at Vierville, got so bad that their 115th Regimental Combat Team, at least most of it, was shoved over here, and they came in along with the 18th. And how Omaha Beach would eventually fall was with a great sweeping motion here from east to west. And they finally caved in this whole Vierville section much later in the afternoon and to a much smaller extent than we see here at the table. But not only was that tough decision not required by the American player here, bringing in the 115th and 18th honestly wasn't even required at all. By this point of the game, it honestly just wasn't worth it. But yeah, that's where we wound up with our game. All 4 draws are resolutely open. That's not even a question. Collioure-sur-Mer has fallen, Vierville's fallen, Saint-Laurent has fallen. The Americans did pay a much higher price, but they have definitely achieved their objectives, both in game terms and the historical objectives that they were assigned here actually on June 6th, 1944. Quick note, if you actually travel to Normandy nowadays, you're going to find the cemetery, the American cemetery, is pretty much this rectangle right here. It's definitely a very sobering place to visit. I recommend that be on everyone's bucket list if you haven't been there already, and if you're ever in France, make it a point to visit that cemetery. That again is pretty much right here overlooking Easy Red. But not to end things on too much of a somber note, the Americans have definitely and unmistakably walked away with a very, very solid win here. Alright everyone, there we have it. We have now completed a 25-hour game of Panzer Leader. Suffice it to say, the Americans have won a decisive victory. I mean, it wasn't even close. There were 11 objective hexes on the table. The Americans were required to take 7 of them by the end of the game. They took all 11 without even really breaking a sweat, especially near the end of the game. By the end of the game, as you saw, I didn't even really bother bringing on 115th and 18th Regimental Combat Teams. It honestly wasn't even worth it at that point. This doesn't mean that those first 8 turns or so weren't really harrowing. If you're looking for more of the Saving Private Ryan experience, check out part 1 of this video. Again, link is in the description. But once the Americans started getting tanks on the beach, as well as mortars, both the 81mm and those 4.2-inch chemical mortars, not to mention M7 priests for direct fire support, yeah, the writing was on the wall. The historical results for Omaha Beach were nowhere close to this. The Americans didn't make nearly this much progress. So again, what we wound up seeing in this game is more of a representation of Omaha Beach had more things gone according to plan. Honestly, I think I made a couple mistakes, not in the gameplay, but in the scenario design. I made it way too easy for the Americans to get armor on the beach. Granted, the Americans did have some killer die rolls there in those first couple turns for 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions. But yeah, it was just too easy for the Americans to get tanks on the beach. And so we wound up with this wildly ahistorical result. I may have also overestimated the effect of American tactical air support in my scenario design. Of course, there was air support for all these invasion beaches on the historical date, but I don't think there was this much. In fact, there's a couple accounts out there that said that tactical air support didn't really do very much. That definitely wasn't the case here. Those P-47s not only took out all the flak positions that were facing them, but probably even more importantly for the poor guys on the sand, they went back into the German backfield and just started hunting German artillery, knocking out battery after battery after battery. Nebelwerfer's 10.5 centimeter field howitzers, 120mm mortars, 80mm mortars, they were just killing all this German artillery that again could no longer use that pre-sighted rule for artillery support missions against the Americans on the beach. But that's where we wound up, and that's where we're going to leave it for today, folks. Thanks very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. Please remember to hit that notification bell. Also, please consider joining the Sitrep Podcast Discord. There is an auto-accept invitation link to our Discord in the description of this video. Come by, check out what everyone's doing on the table, and even better, show us what's going on your hobby table. For now, we are rounds complete for another episode of the Sitrep Podcast. I'm your host, Oriskany Jim, and as always, Tango Mike for watching.